The Imperial-class Star Destroyer was the pride of the Imperial Navy. These 1-mile-long Durasteel battleships had more firepower than an entire Rebel sector fleet. The Empire had more than 25,000 of these ships, and that was just one type of Star Destroyer. It is an undeniable truth that the Empire had the largest navy in the history of the galaxy, yet at the same time, it's also undeniable that for a military force to hold and take ground, they needed more than just massive ships and Death Stars. The Empire needed ground forces, specifically a lot of the lowly infantry grunt types. I mean, sure, you can mechanize infantry, give them crayons to munch on and some air support, and it will increase their effectiveness, but rarely are military operations successful when inadequate infantry forces are supplied. Unless, of course, your idea of success is the complete eradication of your enemy's planet from orbit. But for every other planet that needed to be taken intact, from Lothal to Kashyyyk to the massive planet-wide urban labyrinth that was Coruscant, the Stormtrooper Corps was basically key for any Imperial occupation. In today's video, we're going to take a look at how competent the Stormtroopers are and compare them to their predecessor, the Clone Trooper. Now, most military forces in the galaxy are going to look towards the younger population for their recruits. Younger people have less baggage, there's less information, opinions, and attitudes baked into their minds. The idea here is that it's easier to shape something that hasn't already been molded and then fired up and hardened in the kiln that is life experience. The individuals who come with previous baggage and ideas on how to do things need to be broken down completely and built up from the ground. It's actually a very long and tough process. A huge advantage you get with the clone army is that indoctrination is more or less built in at the genetic level. And this all starts before the trooper even leaves the womb. The Kaminoans would use Jango Fett, one of the most dangerous bounty hunters in the galaxy, as the genetic template for the clone army. The Dolphin scientists altered the clones' DNA to make them less aggressive and more willing to follow orders, while at the same time maintaining Jango Fett's fearlessness and intelligence. I mean, for all the flack the Kaminoans get for looking like dolphins, they actually did an excellent job here. The clones were not only terrific soldiers, but in general, stellar examples of what a human being should be. The only real weakness that the clone troopers had was their accelerated aging. They basically aged twice the rate of the average human being. This meant they reached adulthood by 9 years and were combat ready, and this also meant that they spent a lot less time at peak physical shape. The cost of the clone trooper program was ridiculous. The 9-year process of raising, feeding, clothing, and training the clones made them easily 5 to 10 times more expensive to train than a stormtrooper. The stormtroopers were drawn from the general populace, and they would basically go through the Imperial Academy system, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But this means the Empire did not need to personally raise the stormtroopers from birth. Instead, the families of the Empire subsidized this child-rearing process, significantly lowering the costs. It was also considered an honor to join the Stormtrooper Corps. It was considered a very elite fighting force. And for very poor families in the Outer Rim, there was no better alternative than to send their kids to the Imperial Academy program and hope for placement in either the Stormtrooper Corps or the Imperial Navy. Clones are trained from birth for battle and war. In this way, they're not all that different from Mandalorians or Spartans or any other self-respecting warrior society. This training started with just basic conditioning, basic education, and then would progress to more military-focused activities like weapons training, strategy and tactics, vehicle identification, medical training, and whatever else you could think of the clones probably could do. And this again is due to the clone troopers' abnormally long period of training, which lasts 9 years. That's easily 9 times longer than most infantry grunts get before they get deployed into combat. Although none of the clones had real battlefield experience outside of the simulators, very realistic simulators mind you, every clone on the battlefield could double as a walker pilot, a heavy weapons expert, medic, commander, and even as a starship pilot. Now, there was specialization within the clone army, of course. But what people failed to realize about the clone army was that every individual clone was a Swiss army knife, which is why the Battle of Geonosis was such a waste of life, skill, and talent. Now, the Stormtrooper Corps is considered one of the most elite fighting forces within the Empire that isn't small unit special forces. Usually, elite cadets in the Imperial Academy were given a chance after graduation to attend one of the many Stormtrooper academies in the galaxy. Generally speaking, the most intelligent individuals would end up in an Imperial Naval Academy on a fast track to becoming a bridge officer or starfighter pilot, whereas the strongest and most brutal individuals were sent to the Stormtrooper training pipeline. The Stormtrooper Corps was much more ideologically driven, and they basically worshiped Palpatine and the Empire. It wasn't uncommon, especially for Imperial Navy pilots, to defect to the rebellion, especially after the destruction of Alderaan. But defection to the rebellion for Stormtroopers was extremely rare, not only because they didn't have access to starfighters and ships, but because of the types of individuals that were recruited into this branch of Imperial service and the heavy indoctrination they received. As a matter of fact, a good portion of a Stormtrooper's training was spent on mental training, and this was not only indoctrination, but also numbing of one's emotions. Stormtroopers were supposed to be robotic on the battlefield. They were supposed to ignore their own emotions, ignore their fallen comrades, and fight to the bitter end, disregarding their own safety. What the Empire really wanted to do here was to eliminate the individual and then replace him with this faceless soldier that was both terrifying and efficient at doing their job. This is why Stormtroopers had their names replaced with numbers and were discouraged from idle chatter with their squad mates during missions. Then when it comes to the actual military training, a Stormtrooper's education was very complete and comparable to other elite infantry fighting forces. Some Stormtroopers also received specialized training to become drivers, scouts, and heavy weapons specialists. But because the Stormtrooper Corps was essentially an expeditionary force or a light infantry force, they didn't really have that many vehicles or larger weapons systems that they needed to train on. These guys were infantry grunts first and foremost. The Republic military was basically non-existent before the Clone Wars started, and so very little effort was placed into changing the organization of the Republic military. All you basically had was the Republic Navy and the Grand Army of the Republic. The GAR, therefore, was a massive and heavily equipped force that had all of the equipment and weapons to carry out combined arms maneuver warfare by themselves and didn't really have to rely on other branches for any kind of support. The standard clone trooper unit was actually mechanized as well, which gave them a huge boost in mobility and firepower. A 20-man clone trooper platoon was usually deployed alongside an all-terrain tactical enforcer tank. This was a well-protected walker vehicle that had a mass-drive cannon for anti-vehicle or anti-fortification duties and direct fire support. It also had 6 heavy laser cannon turrets for anti-personnel or anti-light vehicle duty. The ATTE was surprisingly fast and very maneuverable. It could even walk up vertical surfaces, and it could also be pressurized so that these units could operate in space. The ATTE was usually brought into battle by the LAAT carrier variant, although some clone quick reaction forces and airborne light infantry units were also deployed in LAAT gunships without walkers. The LAAT and ATTE platforms could also carry the all-terrain reconnaissance transport. All of these vehicles were produced either by Quad-Drive Yards or their subsidiary Rathana Heavy Engineering. The fact that all of these weapon systems were built into one unified system made them extremely efficient and easy to use. This made the clone trooper an incredibly mobile and effective modern fighting force. For most of the first few years of the Clone Wars, the clone troopers were heavily outgunned by the separate droid army. It was only their brilliant use of these systems that the JR was able to sustain their fighting capabilities and limit casualties. The Stormtrooper Corps were technically supposed to be a shock trooper unit or a vanguard force that leads an offensive. These types of units generally had massive amounts of firepower and heavily armored vehicles deployed alongside them. But in actuality, that's what the clone troopers were all about. The Stormtroopers, again, were light infantry. Stormtroopers were usually stationed on board Imperial Navy vessels. This meant that all of their equipment also had to fit on board these ships. The Imperial Army would usually operate larger vehicles for the Stormtrooper Corps, like the AT-AT Walker, a powerful upgrade from the AT-TE platform, but with one severe weakness, which was their height and how easy it was to tip them over. Stormtroopers could be deployed using shuttles like the Lambda or Sentinel class, but as you can tell from its design, these craft were not designed for assault landings. Later on, the Imperial transport would be more commonly used. These had a forward deployment ramp, which created a fatal funnel for the Stormtroopers on board. This was done to encourage the infantry to quickly leave their transports and not get bogged down. As a light infantry unit, the Stormtroopers' most important equipment was what they carried with them at all times. This was the standard issued Stormtrooper armor and their E-11 blaster. These two pieces of kit both seem to be inspired by the clone trooper equivalents, the Phase 1 and Phase 2 clone armor and the DC-15A carbine. It's theorized that Stormtrooper armor was actually less protective than Phase 1 Clone Trooper armor, although I should mention that the latter armor was incredibly stiff and very uncomfortable to wear. While the Stormtrooper looks a lot like the Clone Trooper, I hope this video has explained to you guys why there are so many differences between these two organizations, and this leads us to our last section, which discusses the purpose both military forces were created for. The Grand Army of the Republic was built for sector-wide battles that raged across multiple planets and solar systems. We're talking about tens of thousands of artillery pieces, walkers, and other combat vehicles, millions of infantry soldiers, and giant fleets in orbit vying for control. Although only a handful of Kaminoans and Sith Lords knew that the Clone Wars was coming, the Clone Army was specifically designed to fight in these massive battles. They had the right tools and right skills to achieve success in almost any kind of situation. The only thing that really held them back was their Jedi commanders. The Stormtrooper Corps was also a military force designed with grand intentions. Well, political intentions in my opinion. The Clone Army actually did an excellent job at ending the Clone Wars, and so the first 10 years of Imperial rule was relatively stable and peaceful. The Stormtrooper Corps was designed alongside the framework of the Tarkin Doctrine. Tarkin believed that the galaxy was too large for the Empire to control through conventional means. Instead, what was needed was a threat of force so large that no one would dare rebel against the Empire. This means that the Imperial military was not actually designed or tested to be effective on the battlefield. Instead, it was a military force designed to create fear. You had faceless stormtroopers, massive star destroyers, and super lasers, and while all of these individual weapons were incredibly powerful, they were also built with a form over function mindset. Which means when the Rebel Alliance started forming into a real military threat, the Stormtrooper Corps, along with the rest of the Imperial military, was woefully prepared for the conflict. So the Clone Army was a real military force, and it was designed to fight other conventional military forces, whereas the Stormtrooper Corps was kind of like a pale shadow of what the Clone Troopers were. I mean, they were at best a peacekeeping force, but they really weren't suited for actual large-scale battles like the Clone Troopers were. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy,